So a bit of my background, I am an assistant professor of forestry and silviculture at Cal Poly, which is at California Polytechnic State University. We're located on the central coast of California, sort of in between LA and San Francisco. And we're sort of known for agricultural engineering and also the forestry program. I started here last year, so this is my second year. It's been great to go back to in person, particularly for teaching. A lot of my work here involves teaching. We have a heavy teaching load, but today I'll talk more about some of the research I was doing as a postdoc at University of Colorado Boulder, and some of this work I'm still continuing to do in California, but more in a kind of a different setting. So I know there's a lot of us with different backgrounds in this group, and happy to be a part of this esteemed group in Finland. But I'll talk today a bit about forests as a climate solution. I think this is a topic that's kind of familiar for many of you, particularly in Finland, knowing that Finland is known for forestry. But I'm specifically looking at kind of understanding the existing forest offset market and how that connects to more sort of hands-on practical forest management here in the United States. First, I'll kind of go over the details of why forests are viewed as a great sort of natural climate solution, and I'll go over what that means in terms of what is meant by something being a natural climate solution. I'll talk about offset markets in the US, and then I'll present some of the results that we have sort of gathered so far. So part one will focus on defining improved forest management. And then part two, I'll talk about our recent work that's coming out hopefully this spring in a format of a publication where we're sort of assessing existing forest carbon offset projects and how they, oh, there's a typo, my bad, how they relate to sort of landscape context. So going over some of the sort of land management basics, as we know, for many of us who work in the climate sphere, we know that land management is kind of a key component in climate change mitigation. So decisions around land management have a massive effect on what happens to carbon emissions, for example. So natural climate solutions is this kind of a hot topic that has emerged from the US in the last 3 to 4 years. And it essentially describes a set of specific land management actions or interventions aimed at mitigating climate change. And they have recently been introduced as this sort of cost-effective tool for increasing carbon sequestration in terrestrial ecosystems, and particularly in forested ecosystems. And prior work, a lot of this work has been done by the Nature Conservancy and the scientists within. And they've identified 3 forest pathways that could be considered natural climate solutions, and they include reforestation, avoided conversion, and then improved forest management. And the last, improved forest management, is more of an umbrella term for management that occurs as an alternative for the business as usual management. And since these terms were introduced, a lot of these definitions, particularly for improved forest management, have been shaped or to some extent defined by entities tied to the California cap and trade market and the voluntary offset market. So our work is kind of focusing on understanding improved forest management from the perspective of practical forest management and silviculture, meaning that we're trying to deduct, in a way, what does improved forest management mean at the sort of stand level, operational level of forest management. As in many other regions of the world, forests in the US and forest soil are a major sink of carbon, currently offsetting approximately 12% of the emissions of annual greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, actually, what as it comes to surprise, at least to a lot of my students often, is that soil carbon is a major carbon storage, and it's actually one of the largest stocks of global terrestrial carbon. And in a lot of the temperate and boreal systems, soil carbon can account for up to 70% of the total carbon of the stand or the ecosystem. Going back to the market, so currently there's one offset and cap and trade market that is operating in the U.S. and it's operated by California Air Resources Board that oversees all the cap for companies as well as the offsets that are issued that are more on the voluntary basis. And this market has been ballooning in the last couple of years as the demand for these offsets is just exploding. We found through prior work that 88% of these voluntary offsets that they sell through the market are considered improved forest management, meaning that this is the most common sort of forest pathway applied in these forest offset projects. But what we don't know is that what is improved forest management in the practical context, and we also don't know specifically what sort of acreages or hectares of projects we have in each state. This looks like a crazy diagram. I will not go over it in detail, but it's just kind of the outline of how the crediting process works within the California cap and trade market. So at the top, you have the compliance offset program. So this is a compliance market, meaning that there are 450 companies in California that are mandated to participate in this cap. So they have to trade their emissions in order and also partially reduce their emissions. So the companies are able to kind of go through this market in trading their emissions, the emission credits that they have, but also buy these voluntary offset program credits that you see at the bottom. Essentially, there are third parties that are involved in the verification of the offsets. It's a big booming business. And since this is the only emissions trading market in the U.S., there's a lot of projects that are located outside of California as well. And different companies different entities who sell these offsets have different project permanence. So currently the two bigger ones, Climate Action Reserve has 100 years, meaning that if you do want to put your forest stand into a voluntary offset program, you have to maintain the carbon pool for 100 years. American Carbon Registry that has a lot of projects up on the East Coast, their requirement is 40 years, so they differ in that. I have actually permission from Sarah to share this slide. So these are just the overview of the carbon market types. Again, you have the voluntary market and then there's the compliance market. A lot of the voluntary market offsets are kind of focused on companies interested in demonstrating to their consumer and their stakeholders that they're interested in improving their any sort of carbon activity that's involved in their day-to-day processes. For example, if you buy something from Etsy, I think at the last page where it says that your shipping is carbon neutral, it's because Etsy has bought carbon offsets from a forestry program in northern Minnesota. I actually have some photos of that project location coming up later. You can see the price difference, in the compliance market. The allowances tend to trade higher. But as for the voluntary market, the forestry credits right as of last week were $18 a ton of carbon dioxide. So that's a fairly good price. And again, a lot of these big companies are involved in buying these offsets. Here that's UPS, Delta, AV's budget, but another big buyer, Facebook or Meta, and then Microsoft have purchased these carbon offsets from forestry programs. So this is kind of a figure that's both a result and a finding and just background information. We recently did a study where we looked at, again, these project areas and their sizes of the projects and where they're located. We can see that there's a lot of the contiguous USA, a lot of the projects are located in the forest dense northern parts of California and also parts of Oregon and Washington. There tends to be higher densities in projects and on some of the eastern states, but they're usually smaller in size compared to the West. Alaska, as shown on the map, has massive less owners, but more project acreage per project. So large projects in Alaska. So, like I said, why we sort of established the importance of forest as a climate solution, we again don't know what is the best quote unquote way to manage forest for carbon, and how do we manage forest in the world of changing climate to increase carbon in those stands. And some of the sort of more practical forest management applications that's been put forward by a lot of this natural climate solution work has talked about extending rotations. So as we say in Finnish, kiertoajan pidentäminen, meaning that the idea is that you maintain the carbon stock in the stand by just letting the trees be there physically for a longer time. But as many people know in forestry who work in practical forest management, this is, of course, creating a lot of new challenges, particularly here in California, where we're seeing these massive wildfires and across the West in the US, meaning that if the more biomass we have in the stand, the higher the intensity of the fire tends to be. So if we think about how a forest practitioner can approach, carbon in their stand, or a family forest owner, or any sort of forest owner, the question is that can we offer some alternative management options than just essentially extending rotations? So some of the work, there's a paper, of course we have to advertise our own work here. There's a paper that came out last year. We co-authored with researchers from U.S. Forest Service and my colleagues at University of Colorado Boulder, is that we kind of tried to answer the two questions. What should improved forest management include? Do we have any existing alternatives known for their carbon benefit to extended rotations? And then the third question is something that we're currently focusing on, and kind of understanding forest carbon in the landscape, and how can we come up with a framework for assessing that, particularly in the market context. I talked about the ETSI project. Of course, it's not an ETSI project per se, but they bought the offset. So this is a stand owned by UPM in northern Minnesota, where they're doing sort of, I don't want to use the word different, but different type of forest management that's considered business as usual for the region. Minnesota, there's a heavy plantation type aspen forestry. A lot of that aspen is used for pulp. But here we have an example where they're sort of maintaining or aiming to maintain or enhance existing carbon stocks while retaining the certain native forest character. We can see that there's birch. There's also white spruce. They're also introducing pine that was largely eradicated from the area in the past. So they've approached the management of the stand from more of maintaining the carbon stocks and then maintaining the carbon sequestration potential. So this is what the stand looked like before. And this is what it looks like on the other side of the road, where they've already applied some of that management. So we can see larger conifer trees, less on the broadleaf trees, and also shifting the age structure of the stand. So you have these longer living conifer trees be reintroduced into the system. And they're also managing in patches versus doing a clear cut. That's very common in these aspen plantations. Moving on, I don't want to go over time. So part two, we're currently sort of focusing on this idea of how do we assess forest carbon offsets in the landscape context. So we know, based on some of the work that we've done, that almost 200 million offset credits have been traded to the California offset market, and 90% of those are forest based. So it's this massive market that is showing a gigantic research gap in terms of us in forestry not quite knowing what sort of management is applied in these existing projects. We're also trying to figure out what sort of disturbance risks would these projects have. And we've recently focused a lot on wildfire, because, again, that's the major disturbance sort of threatening the working forests of the West, particularly here in California. So just briefly about the methods, we kind of scour through the online freely available existing databases for these projects, because this is a government entity, this market run by California State. They're by law legally obligated to provide access to the documentation for all these offset projects. So while it took a while, we were able to get hold of all these existing project documentations. And then what we did after is that we kind of deducted from all the documentation what sort of management has been applied in each of these projects. We also made note of the location, the owner, and how many credits or offsets they have received. And then we used forest inventory analysis, which is very similar to the one done in Finland. It's done here also every 5 years, so meaning that there's certain sampling plots across the U.S. that the Forest Service would measure for a multitude of indicators, including above ground carbon and also soil carbon. Finally, we kind of overlapped like more in a mapping component, we overlapped the fire risk, wildfire hazard potential, which is a raster created by the U.S. Forest Service in assessing wildfire hazard potential for different regions. We overlap that with the project locations that for the carbon offset projects. And this, I showed this to you again. But so briefly about the results. So California, Alaska, and Washington have the largest forest carbon offset projects, and private companies are the largest owner group. They own about half of the offsets, and closely followed by tribal communities and also NGOs. And in terms of forest management, a lot of the documentation were kind of vague coming from a forester's perspective. So there's a lot of overlap in terminology. So many projects also listed multiple management strategies, and therefore are also counted in our analysis in multiple categories. A lot of them mentioned uneven age management. So that was almost a bit over a third of the offsets. And again, if we look at the management, a lot of them highlight that they're not applying commercial harvest. However, they are applying some sort of management. So this, again, coming from forestry is kind of a question mark. How, like, you can't state that you're not applying commercial harvest, but you're still doing some sort of management? And yeah, there was just a lot of questions. I think we got more question marks after this round of findings than prior. Forest soil carbon, we wanted to map this because the current wildfires are burning in such higher intensities. As some of my colleagues at Cal Poly and also in Colorado are finding that the surfaces, the duff and the litter and parts of the forest soil carbon are also lost in the fire. Again, we see kind of the correlation with the project locations having a lot of above ground carbon. We're also seeing that there is higher densities of forest soil carbon in those locations as well. The same for litter carbon layer. And then finally, I still have like a minute and a half, I think. We found that the fire risk for a lot of these projects is significantly high. So actually 96.5 of the offset projects in California right now are in a high or very high risk of wildfire, meaning that a lot of these offsets that the companies have already purchased are likely or more than likely to burn in the next 5 to 10 years. So this is something that was actually brought up by New York Times and LA Times after these massive fires that we've experienced here in California in the last year, that the permanence of these offset projects is somewhat questionable. So take home, we've sort of concluded that improved forest management, for it to be effectively implemented at a large landscape scale, we need more research, insights from research. We should look for like the current practices applied in silviculture across the West and kind of finding that guideline, and then including fuel management. And then we should include forest soil carbon as a management component in all these improved forest management efforts. And this is a slide I always show my students in our carbon class, is that, of course, we talk about carbon a lot in forestry, but it's just one component of forest. It's just one product or service that we that forests provide to us. So we should not only focus on that in terms of management. And adding to that, we should also think about management actions in the landscape context and over long periods of time. And I think this is a great figure because it illustrates how, depending on what scale of carbon we look at, there's a massive change in how it kind of fluctuates across time. So keeping that in mind when we think about carbon. And of course, going forward, thinking of climate and the climate unknowns. These are photos from our old hometown Boulder from 2020, when Colorado actually had its largest wildfires. The other one showing Rocky Mountain National Park, the East Troublesome Fire, and then the other one on the right showing the Cameron Peak Fire. These are, of course, challenges that we're facing in terms of forest management. But like said, the offsets are intimately at risk of just evaporating essentially through wildfire. So then next steps, because you all have a lot of time to read everyone's papers, I put in an ad for mine. If you're interested in kind of figuring out improved forest management means, or at least what we've deducted it means. And then next steps that we're focusing on research-wise is kind of understanding the link between, again, practical, more stand level forest management and carbon offsets. Also assessing fire risk, or is there some type of management we can apply that would reduce the risk of fire? And then we actually are calling for a larger framework from the state to provide like a framework and assessing the efficacy and the transparency of these existing forest carbon offset projects. Are we actually seeing any added carbon benefits from any of these projects, or are we just selling offsets for existing carbon and not, offering any sort of added carbon benefit? And hopefully in the future we can focus on the disturbances. And the image here is from Dixie Fire, California's history's largest fire last year. And this is from PG&E, which is the largest electricity provider, including to my house. And it's one of their mass cameras that actually took the photo of the start of the fire. And with that, I'm hoping I am not too much over time. I thank you for your time, and thank you for this opportunity and to come and present some of the work that we do here.